Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amy Sam. I am the Health Education Project Specialist at the Maxwell and Eleanor Blum Patient Family Learning Center at Mass General Hospital. Today's program is part of our Mass General Cancer Center Genetics Series, which is a special collaboration between the Blum Center and Mass General Cancer Center. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few items with you all. Please note that today's session is being recorded for educational purposes. If you're interested in viewing the recording, you may visit the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. Please note that everyone is in listen-only mode. Everyone has been muted so that we can hear our guest speaker today. If you have any questions for our guest speaker, you may use the chat feature, which is located above your screen. We'll have time from the end. Only Blum Center staff, our co-host and guest speaker will see your questions. Please do not share any personal medical information or questions in the chat box. If you have a personal medical question, please ask your doctor. Lastly, at the end of today's session, you'll be directed to a brief survey, which we'd like to ask you to take. Your feedback is important to us as we plan future programs. So next, I'm going to hand it over to Devin Punch. She is Mass General Cancer Center's health educator, and she will introduce you all to today's guest speaker.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. And a special big thank you to Stephanie Hicks for joining us and speaking. Ms. Hicks joined the Center for Cancer Risk Assessment in 2017 after graduating from the University of Colorado with a master's in genetic counseling. She earned her Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry in 2013 from the University of Vermont and worked as a lab technician in a cancer and cell biology lab at the university before beginning grad school. As part of the CCRA, Ms. Hicks provides risk assessment and genetic counseling services in both the breast, ovarian, and GI cancer genetic clinics. She's available in both Boston and Danvers and sees patients virtually and in person. Thank you so much for being here today, and I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Devin. I will share my screen and make sure this is actually the right orientation for everyone. That's the right way, correct? Yeah, thank you. So again, thank you so much for having me. I really like doing these talks at the Blum Center, so I appreciate the opportunity. And really my goal today is to talk about cancer genetics and how that's changed in the past and what we do presently. So on our agenda, I think it's really helpful to first go over what genetic counseling is. A lot of people aren't familiar with what a genetic counselor is until they meet with us, so I'll go over that a little bit. We'll talk about what cancer genetic testing is and what it involves. We'll discuss historic cancer genetic testing and how this has changed over time. We'll also talk about what we do currently in clinic for genetic testing, and then compare modern genetic testing options, really to go over direct to consumer testing compared to the genetic testing we order in clinic. So first and foremost, to answer the question, what a genetic counselor is, this quote is pulled from our National Society's website, National Society of Genetic Counseling. Genetic counselors are professionals who have specialized education in genetics and counseling, and we provide personalized help to that patients may need to make decisions about their genetic health. Today, there are more than 5,000 genetic counselors, at least registered with our National Society. We help counsel patients to help facilitate informed decisions about genetic testing, and we help people understand and adapt to the medical, psychological, and familial implications of doing genetic testing and how it contributes to their health. We'll interpret their family and medical histories to assess the chance that they have a hereditary syndrome or the recurrence of that syndrome or disease in their family. And we provided education about inheritance, testing options, medical management implications, screening and prevention. We also provide support and research resources, and in some settings, we'll also provide research opportunities. We also, last but not least, provide post-test counseling to help an individual and their families incorporate this genetic information into their healthcare picture. So a couple of examples of how genetic counselors are involved in clinic. This list is not exhaustive, but just to cover 3 broad areas, we are available in the prenatal setting, and we may help couples discuss the possibility of their first child to have a genetic condition, or you may meet with a couple that wants to discuss the risks of subsequent children having a genetic condition they know both parents have, or that one of their current offspring has. We also are seen in the pediatric setting, and we may help evaluate why a child is not developing typically, or why a child is not processing food or nutrients, typically more of a metabolic condition. And also pediatric cancer is something we talk about in a pediatric setting as well. And then in the adult setting, we may discuss or evaluate someone for an undiagnosed health concern. We can manage a known genetic condition or metabolic condition. And last but not least, what we'll talk about today in the adult setting, hereditary cancer predisposition. So in the cancer world, at least in the pre-test setting, what do we do? So who do we see first and foremost? So we see a lot of different patients. We may see someone that's newly diagnosed with cancer. We may see someone with a personal history. Maybe they were diagnosed with cancer early on in their life and they're, far out from that diagnosis. Maybe a person has never had cancer, but they have a really strong family history of cancer and they want to know about their risk of potentially developing cancer in their lifetime. We also see patients with rare types of cancer, and at Mass General, we also have specialty clinics that focus on certain genetic syndromes that have very specialized tumors or cancers that we'll see develop. In clinic, in the pre-test setting, we provide risk assessment. So first reviewing a personal and family history relating to cancers and tumors. We discuss genetic testing options and discuss implications of doing genetic testing and not doing genetic testing. And you may be asking yourself at this point, so what? Why do people want to know this information? I like to think of genetic testing in the cancer setting as potentially accomplishing 3 different goals. One is giving the patient or their family the why. Some people really want to know why they have a diagnosis of cancer or why there's a family history of cancer, and genetic testing may be that answer. Really, the, cool thing about cancer genetic testing is that we have medical management implications. We know that if you have a mutation in one of these genes, we know that that person may benefit from being monitored a little bit differently by their healthcare providers, or they should be plugged into a specialist that manages people based on their genetic testing. We might find out about other cancer risks that maybe we haven't seen in the family, but we know that person is genetically predisposed to develop. And last but not least, once we find a hereditary cause for cancer in the family, we can then test other family members to say, do they carry this risk? And if so, how should they be managed by their doctors to keep them as healthy as possible as well? So to shift gears, I think to talk about what cancer genetic testing involves. A lot of things have changed, which I think is the goal of today's talk, but some things haven't. And the kind of 4 main areas that haven't really changed are how our genes are inherited. That's pretty standard, and we'll go over that. What gene variations or mutations are, how cancer forms genetically. I think the trickiest thing to explain is that all cancer is genetic, but most cancer is not hereditary. And the genes associated with hereditary cancer risk. Now, the amount of genes we know associated with hereditary cancer risk has definitely changed over time, but the kind of subset of genes that every human has that potentially increases your risk for hereditary cancer hasn't changed. So I think it's helpful to to talk about what genes are as a good foundation. So our genes are like instruction manuals that allow our cells and therefore our bodies to grow and function properly. This isn't a formal sequence of DNA, but just to give you an idea, our genes are spelled with a certain alphabet and they need to be spelled a certain way to be read properly and to function properly. So when we talk about how these genes are inherited, we all have the same 20,000 genes as humans, and we all have 2 complete sets of these 20,000 genes, and we get 1 complete set from our moms and 1 complete set from our dads. So in a very simplified way, if you can imagine, every gene of the 20,000 genes, we have 4 possibilities to inherit. 1 copy from mom and 1 copy from dad. So that's really how inheritance works, is we get one copy from mom and 1 copy from dad and end up having a total of 2 complete sets of 20,000 genes to grow and function properly as humans. So when our genes don't function properly, or we have a hereditary predisposition, we're actually talking about mutation, which we now refer to as pathogenic variants or likely pathogenic variants. And really the basis of a mutation is a spelling mistake in the gene that causes that gene to not function properly. So it doesn't mean you have this gene or not. We know you have it. We just want to know if it's spelled correctly, therefore functioning properly. So an example of this, again, just a sequence I typed out of the, a typical gene that's supposed to be spelled a certain way. Mutation or pathogenic variant may be a single letter change that makes this gene not function properly. Or maybe you have a spot of the gene that's completely deleted or maybe duplicated that kind of interrupts the function. So those are a couple of examples of what a mutation or a pathogenic variant is. And for the purpose of hereditary cancer, how pathogenic variants are inherited from a hereditary standpoint, if we go back to that figure or a simplified version of the figure about how genes are inherited, we have copy 1 from 1 parent, copy 2 from that same parent. And that means that when they have a child, that parent has a chance of, 50% chance of passing down copy 1 and a 50% chance of passing down copy 2. This is considered autosomal dominant inheritance, 50%. So when you have a mutation or a pathogenic variant in, say, copy 2, that parent has a 50% chance of passing down copy 2 to their offspring, which means that there's a 50% chance of passing down that hereditary cancer predisposition to the next generation. And this is independent of gender and also independent of every pregnancy would have the same 50% chance. So one child could have inherited this copy 2 in this case, and the other child could potentially inherit copy 1. So now that we know what genes are and how gene mutations are inherited and what gene mutations are, I wanted to talk about what a cancer gene is. So going back to that number, we all have, the same 2 copies of, 20,000 genes. About 400 to 500 of these genes regulate cell growth in one way. And the regulation of cell growth is really how cancer forms in the first place. So a cancer gene is really any gene that potentially controls cell growth in one way, either expediting cell growth or halting cell growth. And we've found in the science world that about 60 to 100 of these genes that control cell growth are related to a hereditary predisposition to develop cancer. Now, at this point, you may be asking me why cell growth matters. So really the basis of how cancer forms is that this cancer or tumor is really just the overgrowth of cells. So our cells are supposed to be regulated and divide over and over and over again at a regulated rate. So if we have these 400 to 500 genes that are supposed to regulate cell growth, our cells, in theory, should always grow at this regulated rate. But if they no longer have those instructions that are saying grow or divide at this regulated rate, that's really how cancers and tumors form. So if you can imagine, if we all have these 400 to 500 genes that are supposed to regulate cell growth, if you were to write down 400 to 500 sentences, you may make a spelling mistake or two along the way, and our cells are potentially prone to acquiring these spelling mistakes over time. So you may end up with a first mutation, or one of these genes in one of these cells acquires a gene mutation over time, and that's okay. We still have a lot of genes that are supposed to be regulating our cell growth, but these cells that have this mutation are more prone to be unregulated. Then they're more likely or more prone to acquire a second gene mutation, a third, a fourth, and if that keeps happening in a subset of cells, we no longer have these genes that are supposed to regulate cell growth, and that's really how a cancer or a tumor forms. So when we know that this is how every cancer forms, we ask ourselves, what is hereditary cancer predisposition? You may say, well, then all cancer must be related to hereditary cancer predisposition, but that's actually not the case. If we did genetic testing on every tumor that a person has, tumor or cancer, they would have a ton of gene mutations, but we don't know if you were born with any of those gene mutations in every single cell, or if it was just acquired in that subset of cells over time. So when we do hereditary cancer predisposition, we're really telling you, did this cancer in yourself or the family start out at step 1 with every single gene functioning properly? We call this sporadic cancer, a cancer that just happens by chance, not a cancer that was passed down in the family. Or did you start out at step 2 in every single cell in your body with mutation in one of these genes that puts you one step closer to potentially developing cancer in your lifetime? So that's really what we try to discern in the hereditary cancer world is, are you at a step 1 with all of these genes functioning properly, or are you falling into step 2 and have this hereditary risk? So now that we've discussed what a gene is, what a mutation is, how it's inherited, and what genes are involved in hereditary cancer, I wanted to then talk about how far we've come in clinical testing for hereditary cancer predisposition. So I kind of broke this down into a couple different chunks. So between 1996 and 2006, for a decade, we really were just testing for single gene testing or single syndrome testing. We take a family history and say, you're more likely to test positive for this gene or this gene. So that's what we would test someone for. And then in 2006 to 2013, there really was improvements to gene coverage and sensitivity of the gene testing. And then from 2013 to 2019, and really to the present time, we now have more testing labs that are offering hereditary cancer testing, and the advent of multi-gene cancer panels has come up. And I want to explain and use actually a case to kind of go over these different time frames. So, first we'll walk through this case, just to orient everyone who doesn't look at these every single day like myself. We generally use circles for females and squares for males. We draw the arrow to our patient that we're meeting with, and then the colors or the shaded in shapes indicate a cancer diagnosis. So if you can't read on your screen, it might be quite tiny. The red is for ovarian cancer and the green is for breast cancer. And then anyone that's connected by a line like this is a sibling, and then a line down means that these are the parents of the offspring here. So this is mom and dad, and my dad's side, mom's side. So now that I've oriented you to this pedigree, our patient's name is Jane Doe. She is 28 years old, and she wanted to speak to genetics because her mother had just passed from a diagnosis of ovarian cancer, and she wants to know her risk of developing ovarian cancer. And as I mentioned, when going through the colors, we would take the family history. Dad's side is very small, but no family history of cancer as far as we can tell. And it looks like on mom's side, not only did mom have a diagnosis of ovarian cancer quite young at about 46, but her grandmother on mom's side also has breast cancer. So just to keep in mind, the year is 1998. And just as a reminder from that timeline I presented, between 1996 to 2006, we really were doing single gene or single syndrome testing. So we really had two main syndromes that we would kind of put patients into buckets. They would either fall into the hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, or HBOC, or they would fall into Lynch syndrome. So for our case, for hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, HBOC, it's kind of in the name. Our cancer risks are mainly breast cancer and ovarian cancer, and we have two genes that are associated with HBOC, at least from what we know of in 1998. Where Lynch syndrome, we see colon and uterine, and there are 5 genes associated with Lynch syndrome. So in our case, seems like HBOC is a pretty good fit, that we would probably test her for BRCA1 and BRCA2, or the BRCA genes, ideally. So this sounds like a great fit. So what are the concerns? So in 1996, Myriad Genetics was the only testing lab that offered genetic testing for BRCA1 and BRCA2, and they had really patented their sequencing, actually, the sequence of BRCA1 and BRCA2. They began offering clinical testing for individuals and family with a personal and family history of breast and ovarian cancer. But it turns out the sensitivity of the genetic testing technology was not comprehensive, and the cost of testing was a huge issue. And testing ended up being very expensive and often not covered by insurance, at least in the 90s. And this became a barrier for a lot of families that would benefit from getting genetic testing done. So when I say sensitivity of testing, or saying genetic testing coverage wasn't comprehensive, there are kind of two main ways, and there are a lot of different ways to look at genes, but for the purpose of this talk, there are kind of two main ways we can look at our genes. We can look at the sequencing of our genes, which is really checking the spelling, every single letter of the gene. And then also there's deletion and duplication analysis, which is kind of the word count of the gene. So making sure that there aren't big chunks of the gene missing or duplicated. So this is just a schematic of how we check the letters at every single line of the gene. And then we also would look at whether there are chunks of the gene missing, just as kind of examples here. So in 1998, we really were only allowed to, we really could only offer sequencing, no deletion or duplication analysis. So that was the kind of the limitation our main limitation in testing technology at this point. So going back to our case, we were able to get genetic testing covered by this patient's insurance after a month-long correspondence with the patient's insurance. Her testing or sequencing for BRCA1 and BRCA2 did come back completely negative. So we really didn't have anything left to offer this patient besides, fall back on your family history for cancer risk for her. So 10 years later, our patient comes back in 2008, and she reached out to her genetic counselor to ask about updated testing. And the genetic counselor asked her to come in. So just from that timeline again, between 2006 and 2013, there was improvements in gene coverage sensitivity. So going back to our sensitivity or testing coverage we could offer, we now could not only offer sequencing, but also deletion and duplication analysis. So for our patient, we did want to offer her updated coverage of the BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene. Unfortunately, because her insurance hadn't changed in the past 10 years, the patient couldn't get insurance coverage. So she ended up having to pay a couple $1,000s for this additional coverage of the BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene. And still her testing came back negative. So now she's had BRCA1 and BRCA2 sequencing and deletion and duplication analysis and was completely negative. So again, she was sent away to fall back on her personal risk of developing cancer based on her family history. So now in 2020, 2 years ago, the patient comes back again because her cousin was recently diagnosed and passed from ovarian cancer, and that kind of triggered her to check in and see, are there any updates to genetic testing technology now? there's a lot to discuss that's changed between 2008 and 2020. And from the timeline, the advent of multi-gene panels and other testing labs came into the mix. So in 2013, the United States Supreme Court determined that it was not legal to patent something that occurs naturally in nature, or gene sequences occur naturally in nature. So there was no more patents on the BRCA1 and BRCA2 sequencing. So that led to Myriad Genetics, the only testing lab that offered hereditary cancer testing at the time, to no longer have kind of the monopoly on the BRCA1 and BRCA2 clinical gene testing. So now other testing labs could offer these this testing, which led to more competition, which drove down the price. So used to be thousands of dollars, and then it would shift to maybe between $500 and $900, and now present day, it's really only $250 without insurance coverage. So it's still a bill, but a lot more affordable for a lot more patients, which is great. So yeah, more competition led to more competitive pricing. We also had discovered a lot more genes associated with hereditary cancer risk. So historically, again, we really would only test for single gene or single syndrome. And now we know of a lot of other genes associated with hereditary cancer risk. And not that this might be a little tiny for people to read, but just to orient everyone to this chart, we have an example of a chunk of genes that we can clinically test someone for now along the first column here down. And then we actually categorize them or group them together by cancer risk. So all of these genes in the second column with the dot in the breast and gynecologic mean that all of these genes, if you go across this row, are associated with that associated cancer. So we know of a lot more genes we could offer our patient. So really, we went from testing the single syndrome testing, HBOC or Lynch syndrome, now really offering how much information do you want to get from this testing? Do you want to focus on particular types of cancers? So do you want to do a comprehensive breast cancer panel, colon cancer panel, ovarian cancer panel, for example, or do you want to cast the net wider and look at genes associated with common cancers, or all genes that we can offer today in hereditary cancer testing? So really for Jane, the discussion was around how many genes she wanted us to analyze. And she decided she wanted to look at all of the genes associated with hereditary cancer risk that we could clinically offer her today, which is 85 different genes associated with some type of hereditary cancer tumor risk. Now that is more comprehensive than just genes associated with breast and or ovarian cancer. And we found she had mutations in 2 different genes, a BRCA1 gene and a gene called HOXB13. Now, BRCA1 is associated with ovarian cancer, and HOXB13 we know is associated with prostate cancer. Now, as a female, she does not have any prostate tissue, but she does have 2 sons that this would potentially impact. She, at this point, still had her ovaries, so we would now know that she does have this predisposition to developing ovarian cancer based on having BRCA1. So she can, there's even more evidence to potentially have risk-reducing surgery to reduce her risk of developing ovarian cancer in her lifetime. And now that we know this information, even though there's no prostate cancer in this family, we know that the men in this family do potentially have a hereditary risk of developing prostate cancer. So other family members pursued genetic testing. First, her uncle, who also carries the BRCA1 gene mutation in HOXB13, so he can change his monitoring for prostate cancer. The BRCA1 gene mutation doesn't really impact his care. We've only found that it's associated with ovarian cancer. As a male, he does not have ovarian tissue. Her brother subsequently did testing. He does not carry the BRCA1 gene mutation, which is great news for his daughter, but he does carry this HOXB13 gene mutation, so it would impact his prostate cancer screening. And then the cousin one of the cousins on mom's side, also did testing, and it was completely negative for both BRCA1 and HOXB13, which is great news for the patient and also for the subsequent generation. So in summary, the conversation really has shifted over time. Historically, we really would talk about single gene or single syndrome testing. There was a lot of uncertainty, even with positive test results. What do we do with this information? That's, definitely we've learned a lot more about, different genes associated with hereditary cancer. We can give more direction and information now, but historically not as much. And with negative testing, we always suspected there was more there were more genes linked to hereditary cancer risk, but didn't know what to test for. So there was uncertainty around a negative test result as well. Cost and insurance coverage was definitely super limited historically, and would be cost inhibitive for a lot of patients. So presently, at least in the pre-test setting or pre-test setting, we really are asking patients, how much information do you want to get from this testing? Do you want to stay more focused on specific cancer risks, or do you want to go very broad? Obviously, the con or subjective con to testing more broadly is you have the possibility of incidental findings. Some people want to know that information, some people don't. Cost and insurance coverage has, so cost has definitely been driven down by competition. Again, self-pay without insurance coverage is $250 for even all 85 genes. Insurance coverage has also gotten a lot better. So more likely we can get insurance to cover hereditary cancer testing. And we also know a lot more about what to do with this information if it does come back positive. And not that this is the focus of today's talk, but we also are focusing a lot more on helping patients in the post-test setting, even moving from the pre-test genetic counseling to kind of a post-test style too. So just as to give you a little bit more information about medical management implications and how this has changed over time. So genes that have medical management implications, that may mean that we change or recommendations for age in which someone would start a certain screening, or that they would do additional screening that we wouldn't recommend the general population. For example, for hereditary breast cancer risk, we may say a woman that has an increased risk for hereditary breast cancer may start mammograms and breast MRIs maybe at 25 or 30 versus the typical recommendation for any person that has breast tissue to start at mammograms at age 40. It also could be surgical recommendations. If we don't have a really good screening tool for a certain organ, we may recommend to do surgical intervention to reduce the risk of developing cancer over time, or that particular cancer over time. And then we also have can give a person an adjusted lifetime risk. So we generally can give someone, any person walking around, a general lifetime risk of developing cancer. But if we know that they have a hereditary risk, we would adjust that over time, would give them a number. And then we also have a small subset of genes we refer to as preliminary evidence genes that we don't really have too much to do with medical management implications yet. But we just have new data about cancer associations, not sure of the best way to manage, but hopefully we can give a person that information over time, whether that data comes out, the next week when we test that patient, or whether it takes 5 or 10 years. That's the tricky thing when testing really broad for hereditary cancer testing, is these preliminary evidence genes. One thing that has come up in kind of, I guess now not so new, but in the late 2008, 2009, or 2010, is that the genetic test results may be used as a pre-existing condition. We formally refer to this as genetic discrimination. So in 2010, there was a federal law that was put in place that provides some protections against this, referred to as the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA. And this mainly protects our health insurance and our employment from using our genetic information against us. But this doesn't cover everything. So people that want to, life insurance policies, disability policies, long-term care policies are all possible. All of those insurances can request genetic test results and use it against you however they see fit. Some of these policies don't ask about genetic test results, and some ask about really detailed questions. There's no way for us to predict, unfortunately, where they'll fall in that spectrum if you were to test positive and then subsequently modify a life insurance policy or apply for new or more coverage, for example. Another question you may be asking, or you may have seen advertised, is getting your cancer genetic testing through 23andMe. The short answer is yes, but it definitely won't be comprehensive. In March of 2018, the FDA approved 23andMe to report on 3 specific mutations that are commonly found in the Ashkenazi Jewish population in the BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene. And now they also have allowed 23andMe to report on 2 common mutations found in the MUT-YH gene. That's a colon cancer gene. So just to give you an example of what this looks for, so really, if we're saying this is a sequence of either BRCA1 or BRCA2, it really 23andMe is only allowed to report on 3 particular variants, 3 single changes in the BRCA1 or BRCA2 gene. If you had a mutation in any sequence outside of those 3 letters, they legally could not report that out to you. And that's true of MUT-YH as well. If you had a mutation in this, again, outside of these 3 particular areas, they would not report that out. So you could have a gene mutation in any, BRCA1, BRCA2, MUT-YH, or any of these other hereditary cancer genes, get testing at 23andMe, come back negative, but potentially test positive if you've got more comprehensive testing through a healthcare provider. And with that, I wanted to say thank you and welcome any questions. This is our team, definitely not comprehensive. Our team has expanded a lot if you look at the people that are not pictured here at the Center for Cancer Risk Assessment. So these are just a couple of my colleagues, or most of my colleagues. But yeah, I welcome any questions or any thoughts, feedback. Thank you. Should I stop sharing my screen?
Sure, you can pull it down.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that presentation, taking us on a tour throughout the years and all of the advancements in genetic testing. We do have time for some questions now. If there's anything you'd like to ask, you can type it into the chat box and I can relay it to Stephanie. You touched upon this a bit in terms of screening, but if you know that you have a gene responsible for causing cancer, will this affect treatment in terms of course of treatment or how treatment runs?
Yeah, if you have an active cancer, it potentially could. This is definitely a better question for a medical oncologist, but there definitely are some therapies that are newly FDA approved, and definitely in the research world, that if you know that your cancer was caused by a hereditary cancer predisposition, and we know that cancer would respond better to a certain therapy, you would be potentially a candidate to receive that therapy. So, or I think a lot of them are in the maintenance therapy as well realm. So it would definitely be a question to ask your medical oncologist, but in short, it potentially could change your treatment recommendations.
Do some gene mutations happen later in life, or are they all inherited?
So both. So if we're talking about hereditary cancer predisposition, we're talking about a gene mutation that you were born with, something that happened, that you inherited either from mom or dad. But all cancer is basically acquired gene mutations. So technically, yes, you can acquire gene mutations over time, but any of those acquired gene mutations are not able to be passed down to the next generation. So the only gene mutations that can be passed down are ones that you were born with.
Thank you. And you did talk about kind of the ramifications for premiums or ability to get life insurance because of testing positive for hereditary risk. Are there any other sort of challenges or ramifications that you didn't mention related to all of that, or any other considerations that someone should take into consideration?
I think, there, as far as just a little more detail about the protections that we do have. So on the federal level, we have that GINA law, Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. So that by and large covers any sort of discrimination for health insurance policies and employment. There are exceptions to that law. The big ones are if you work for a very small employer, less than 15 employees, or if you work for the government or military, they technically are exempt from that law. So if you are receiving health insurance from the military, for example, they have their own protections, but I'm a little less familiar with what those protections are. But technically, I believe any military employee is kind of exempt from that GINA protection. And we also do have certain states, Massachusetts being one of them, have another level of protection against genetic discrimination or using it as a pre-existing condition. I would say for life insurance policies, disability policies, and long-term care policies, generally it becomes an issue if you do genetic testing, come back positive, and then prompt them to do some sort of investigation into your health history. So if you just do genetic testing, already have a policy put in place, and they won't generally ask about genetic test results randomly, but if you prompt them to generate a quote, that's generally when it could become an issue. I guess legally they could ask at any point, but most of the time, only when you prompt them to do so is when it potentially might have implications. But
Thank you. More questions. My mom had genetic testing a long time ago and was negative, and she has since passed away. Should I pursue genetic testing now?
I would say that if she had testing a long time ago, that more likely she did not have, what we would offer her today if she, walked in newly diagnosed with cancer. And if she's no longer available for testing, the next best people to test are, we say, first degree relatives, so offspring. So you would be, fall into that category, or siblings or parents of that patient.
Thank you. And you did talk quite a bit over how over the years there have been many advancements, things that weren't available previously that are now, and a lot of the details around that. Are there still some kind of question marks or gaps or things that genetic testing isn't doing quite yet? And what do you see kind of on the horizon? Kind of a loaded question there, but.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I don't have a crystal ball to see what it will actually look like. I think that we learn more and more about these genes every day. I think, going back to those numbers, the 400 to 500 genes that regulate cell growth, any of those genes potentially could be a candidate to be a hereditary cancer predisposition. So I think over time, that list of 85 genes that we can clinically test someone for now is going to expand. How quickly that happens, I don't know. It may be slow or maybe quick. But I think that's kind of the biggest thing that I think I see changing over time is the expansion of our knowledge and knowing which genes are linked to hereditary cancer risk. And I also see that I think that more and more in the world of treatment, to go back to that first question, I think that there will be more and more treatments for people that know that they have a hereditary cancer predisposition, develop cancer. And I think that we'll design therapies that are more targeted to treat those cancers specifically. That's also where I see, and doing genetic testing specifically on the tumor itself, which is a little outside of the hereditary cancer world. But I think that will change and become much more mainstream over time. It already is. So.
Thank you for that insight. So we do have some more time. If there are any more questions, you can please type them into the chat box. Is there more risk for inheriting a genetic cancer syndrome from mom's or dad's side?
Nope, it would be that same flip of a coin, 50% chance whether it comes from mom or dad. So it would be the same risk, I would quote.
Give it another minute if there are any questions. And in the meantime, with that last slide you did put up about the team and the contact information, what would it look like, or what would the process kind of be when someone reaches out to you? What could they expect?
Yeah, so if someone wanted to come in because of a personal health history of cancer or family history of cancer, they would, more likely, if they were prompting it, they would ask maybe their care doctor to put in a referral, and that would meet with one of the 15 genetic counselors that work with me, and we would first go through a couple questions about that patient's personal health history, and then also ask about family structure, also relating to cancers and tumors. And that really gives us a complete picture of what patterns are going on in the family. Based on that, we'll give that person a risk assessment, the likelihood based on what we're seeing in the family that this could be hereditary, and what, if any, genetic testing that patient or and their family may benefit from. So we generally say between a 30 and 40-minute conversation in the pre-test setting to talk about, personal and family history, and then to go through all of the different testing implications, insurance coverage, all of that stuff. So.
Great, thank you so much for that. Just helpful to let people know what they can expect.
Yeah.
Can gene mutations responsible for cancer skip generations?
So if a cancer in the family is truly related to something hereditary, it wouldn't skip a generation. So if dad had a hereditary cancer predisposition, he could pass down to his children, that we could truly test that child to say, you're positive, carry this gene mutation, or you're negative, you don't carry this gene mutation. If you are truly negative, then you would have no risk to pass down a hereditary cancer predisposition to any future offspring.
And can we wait just a minute to see if there are any other questions, and otherwise we can end today.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Amy, could you remind us of the Blum link where this will be available afterwards?
Sure, I will enter the link in the chat,
Thank
but
you.
it's massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. The recording will be made available there.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope this talk was helpful. Thank you, Amy, for hosting, and Stephanie, thank you so much for your presentation. Bye, everyone.